Okay guys, just like with my review of the BioShock collection, I'm gonna keep this intro short. A series that has been on handhelds before thanks to the PS Vita. Here is my review of the Borderlands Legendary Collection for the Nintendo Switch. The story of the Borderlands franchise takes place on the planet of Pandora, where a lot of monsters and bandits roam around, and you play as a group of vault hunters that, as their name suggests, are looking for a vault. In Borderlands 1, you are simply looking for a vault to see what is inside, whereas Borderlands 2 is more of a fight for survival, as your entire group was ambushed as soon as you got to Pandora, and you're racing a villain called Handsome Jack to get to the vault before he does. And finally, in Borderlands the pre-sequel, you're actually not on Pandora but on its moon, but you are once again looking for a vault. The stuff that really makes the Borderlands story shine is all of the wacky and witty humor thrown into all of these games.
Here's what's gonna happen, Vault Hunter. My first mate, Boom Boom, is gonna kill ya. Jack's gonna pay us, and I'm gonna play hopscotch in your chest cavity.
Granted, Borderlands 1 is pretty light on story, and what story you do get is pretty much 99% text for missions and not actual cutscenes and story bits. But once you get to Borderlands 2 and see how Handsome Jack constantly taunts you throughout the entire game, not to mention the fact that everything all the way down to small side missions are fully voiced with story and lore, it really starts to become a wacky and fun adventure. When it comes to gameplay, this is a collection of first-person shooter RPGs. As you go through each one of them, there will be lots of open-world exploration, shooting and looting, and tons of leveling and customization. First of all, this collection contains Borderlands Game of the Year Edition, Borderlands 2 Game of the Year Edition, and finally Borderlands the Pre-Sequel Ultimate Edition. Do note that not all of these games can be bought separately like the BioShock games can. You can buy Borderlands Game of the Year Edition on its own, but the only way to get 2 and Pre-Sequel are by either buying the Handsome Collection that contains both of those games, or Legendary Collection that contains all 3. And as far as what content is here, you're getting all 3 of these games with the online co-op features intact and almost all DLC. The only thing that's missing here is the newest DLC for Borderlands 2 that connects it to 3. Now when you start any of these games, you're first introduced to the pretty in-depth class system for playable characters. You've got a bunch of different characters to choose from when you start each run of the games, and all of them have their own class abilities, like the Siren's abilities to use psychokinesis to escape from battle or freeze an enemy in place. And once you actually choose your character and get into the game itself, it's a bit of a mix between open world exploration and doing missions around a hub. In Borderlands 1, you've got a pretty big map, but a lot of time, especially towards the beginning, is centered around a single town that acts kind of like a hub, where you go to town, do missions around said hub, and then you just keep going back until the story progresses forward and lets you go someplace else. And I'll admit that this gives Borderlands 1 a pretty repetitive feel, especially if you're coming from the future games, as Borderlands 2 had a much better open world system where you're not constantly in the same area. You might do 1 or 2 missions around the starting town, but you're constantly moving forward to bigger and different locations, and you go back to previous ones just when you get new side missions that require it. Now while you're doing all of this exploration and doing missions, you're gonna get to the gunplay and looting, which is really the core of what makes Borderlands so much fun. You've got a ton of different weapon types that you can find across the game, from pistols and submachine guns to shotguns and sniper rifles. And the loot-based weapons can also have a lot of unique and different properties, from elemental damage to being able to shoot off exploding projectiles rather than just bullets. To add on to this, you have a special critical hit system where every headshot always rewards you with a huge amount of damage. There's also a ton of customization you can do in the game. You can find a lot of different loot pickups that allow you to change how your grenades work, put in different loadouts, and find special class upgrades to give you really nice buffs. Speaking of customization, I mentioned earlier that this is a group of shooter RPGs. You gain experience from downing enemies and completing missions, allowing you to level up to increase the amount of damage you do, as well as giving you skill points to buy new abilities and upgrades. And here's where the large difficulty spikes also end up being a really rewarding aspect of gameplay. Enemies are constantly increasing in level and difficulty as you go through all of the story missions. This leads a lot of enemies to be really intimidating, but your damage goes up just as much if not more when you level up yourself, leading to an incredibly satisfying feeling when you go back to that boss you were having trouble with and seeing that huge increase in damage. Of course, this isn't always a good thing. Borderlands 1 didn't really balance this system very well. It was very grindy and has you constantly underleveled for all of the missions you go on, even the side missions that you have to do for the main missions. I found myself having to stop and level grind not just for major bosses, but just little mini bosses for the optional stuff. The later games, on the other hand, had really big difficulty spikes for major boss fights, but outside of that, if you just do side missions here and there and keep going with the story, you're not really going to have that big of a problem. Now, as all of these different gameplay systems come together, you have a lot of content in this collection. Each of the games is easily 20 to 30 plus hours on each run, not counting DLC. It's also worth noting that the Switch versions are cheaper than the other console versions. If you stroll over to the PlayStation Store, you'll be chucking out a good $90 for this collection, whereas on the Switch, you're only paying $50. Let's dive into controls for just a second, mostly just to clarify something that I feel is worth noting. All three of these games have built-in gyro aiming, but if you go into the menus, especially in Borderlands 2 and pre-sequel, you cannot enable aim assist and the gyro controls at the same time. If you turn one on, the other one gets turned off. Now let's dive into presentation, which is really nice. Graphically, the game looks very pretty with very few jagged edges outside of really far away environments, and there's just an overall really nice amount of detail. Just take a look at this clip with the scope of the sniper rifle having an accurate magnification of what's in front of you. That's the kind of detail that you don't often see in shooters on handhelds. And as far as performance is concerned, load times can get a little lengthy, but otherwise they're pretty acceptable, and I saw little to no frame drops throughout all three games, which is really exciting for handheld gamers because Borderlands 2 on the PlayStation Vita really struggled going through the city of Sanctuary, but if you look here on the Switch, it handles it without any problems. And with that, let's get out of performance and into battery life. On the original model, the Borderlands Legendary Collection has a battery range of 3 hours and 7 minutes up to 4 hours and 3 minutes. On the Nintendo Switch Lite, it has a range of 3 hours and 43 minutes up to 4 hours and 55 minutes. And on the V2 or Redbox 2019 model, it has a range of 4 hours and 45 minutes up to 6 hours and 41 minutes. In conclusion, the Borderlands Legendary Collection brings the famed looter shooter series back to the handheld world. Now, the downside, Borderlands 1 definitely lacks in the story department and with repetition with missions, but the games look and play great, especially for handheld gamers coming from the Vita version of Borderlands 2. Reviews to go rates the Borderlands Legendary Collection for the Nintendo Switch a 9 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching and have a great day.